Welcome to the Unforgiving 60 with your hosts, Ben Pronk and Tim Curtis. As two ex-SAS guys armed with MBAs, Ben and Tim seek out people leading lives less ordinary and talk with them about how they fill their unforgiving minutes and what helps them go, always, a little further. Like intellectual bowerbirds, we aim to collect shiny little objects of knowledge that we think can help build better humans.
Welcome to the Unforgiving 60 podcast. I'm Tim Curtis.
And I'm Ben Pronk.
Welcome, Ben. And welcome to everyone for this second episode with David Knoff.
Yeah.
We interviewed David early 2021, February, when he was down at Davis Station as the station leader.
Season 3, Episode 3.
Season 3, Epi 3. And he talked about the stress and pressure of leading on the ice. But you know what? It wasn't done. It got a whole lot worse from that point.
Isn't it funny? You couldn't write the stuff, and yet David has written. He's captured the events in a book titled 537 Days of Winter. I was thinking about this. I think even 537 days in an awesome destination would get old. Now, I imagine Antarctica does have its awesome moments, but my goodness, 537 days of winter, of that kind of isolation, of the same people, of, you know, and as he says in this interview, it's not all penguins and sort of southern lights. It's some hard yards and a lot of work. That's pretty arduous, pretty hard.
A really close, tight team, naturally living in everyone's back pocket. There's not much private space at all. Is very communal. They expect to be down there for a year, and then Australian Antarctic Division ring them and say, we can't bring you back at the appointed time. And then it's over to him to manage the consequences of that.
Yeah, and we're going to talk to him about that from a personal and a professional, a leadership perspective. Probably up there with one of the hardest things you're going to have to do. But wait, there's more. In the midst of that, also get hit with a really serious medical emergency. So now you're talking life and death in the midst of this kind of sort of period that David as a leader has had to deal with.
Oh, but wait, there's more. Then on his way back to Australia, they have a fire on board the vessel that's bringing them back, and he'll talk about that and people's responses when they think it's all over to an incident.
Yeah. And look, just in case it sounds like the conversation is going to be all doom and gloom, we're also going to talk to him about some of the highlights and some of the incredible experiences and unique experiences that you literally could not get anywhere else or in any other capacity other than as a member of an Antarctic division, an Antarctic expedition.
Well, let's hear it from David. Let's get on with the show.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Unforgiving 60 podcast. I'm Ben Pronk.
And I'm Tim Curtis.
You are. And today we've got well, they're always special episodes, but this one's particularly special because we have an alum. Yes. So we're absolutely stoked to welcome back David Knoff, fresh or relatively fresh from his 537 Days of Winter and very fresh from the publication of the book of the same name. David, g'day.
G'day, fellas, and it's good to be back this time in a nice, warm, well, I'd say studio. I'm in my home office, but back in Australia on dry land.
And we were just commenting, this is one of those observations that won't work over podcast medium, but you are looking high and tight, as opposed to when we last saw you, where you were looking a little more bedraggled, a little shaggier.
Unruly.
Yeah, I think you described it as the winter woolies were on. Yeah, I think that was probably about day 500 odd. We into our second summer stuck down in Antarctica, and the end was in sight, but there were a few twists and turns still ahead of us that at the time I wasn't aware of. That, yeah.
And it's fascinating talking to you now and sort of re-listening to that original podcast, because I think, like you said, it was around that day 500 of the sort of 537 days. And it's really interesting reading the book about all the twists and turns up to that point, some of which we touched on last time, but then some of the sort of curly ones that you got thrown at even post that point.
Absolutely. And it's been a great journey then, like with the years since coming back to then, and certainly the book really helped to relive and unpack some of the moments along the way. And it was moments that at the time might have been quite quick, and I didn't have enough time to fully appreciate that. Then sitting down, talking to some of the team that were there and going through it and putting it down on paper to get the book out and ready. Also, just to tell our story of what we all went through, and it certainly helped me. And I know a number of the others have said it. It's a good record of what happened, and it's also helped them kind of relive it and unpack it a bit and understand it.
Can we talk? I'm really keen to talk about the contents of the book, but I'd be really keen to start by talking about the writing process. We have spoken in different podcasts about our own sort of journey with the three of us, and it ultimately was a net positive, a really enjoyable experience. My brother Dan, who's, I think I can announce this, in the process of sort of just finalising another book, which he'd written very much as a kind of, well, in fact, a psych told him to write it as a part of a catharsis sort of process to get stuff out of his head and down on paper. Can you reflect on the writing process for you and the team, both in terms of the mechanics, but also the catharsis and that sort of aspect?
Yeah, for sure. And hopefully Dr. Dan's put his sequel will be like the 80-kilo dickhead or something. Or he's probably kept fitter than I have since getting back. No, so it was initially, I actually got, so Mark Wales, who's another alumni of this podcast, I watched an interview with him and his writing coach, Kelly from Good Content, Kel, a bit of a plug for her, and then got in touch with her and said, hey, you helped Mark do his book. What's the process with putting a book together? And this, I was still down in Antarctica at the time and daydreaming about what I'd do when I got back, and I wasn't fully committed. And then once I remember, and to spoiler alert as well, when we were standing in the forecastle of the MPV Everest, 5 days out of getting back to Australia, the nearest land was Heard Island, with a ship full of smoke and fumes and an engine room fire and crews going everywhere trying to fight the fire and get the ship going while we're standing by the lifeboat. So I'm like, well, that was about day 531. I'm like, all right, I think I've got enough to write a book.
You've got enough material.
Yeah, and that was a great final chapter to it all. And spoiler alert, I do live through that.
I was going to say, but you didn't light that fire, did you? Just to get a nice closure? You didn't.
No, don't start that room either as well. I was nowhere near the engine room. I was having a nap at the time. But and then from there, you really have to go through. And there was that. And I know all veterans and others have that kind of battle between, do I become that guy that went and wrote the book, or the value in, okay, this story needs to be told. And that was that historical side of it that probably got me over the line to say, you know what, this is a story worth telling. And I wrote it in the first instance for myself. I spoke to my deputy station leader. I had an incredible team and an incredible deputy station leader. And her role as the chef and DSL really helped me and the team get through the whole experience. So if she hadn't been on board, I wouldn't have done it. And she straight away, she's like, Dave, tell this story. You've got the right sort of head and ability to write this in a truthful yet readable way. And then I went, okay, cool, let's do it. And as I was going, I engaged other members of the team on certain technical aspects of it. The Australian Antarctic program as well were pretty helpful where they could be to help with different facts and providing photos and concurrence with certain things. And then we got to the point of I had a version of the book that was how I wanted to tell it, and gave that out to test readers from the team and from others who'd been to Antarctica and my friends and family back here. And then we sort of had to change a lot of all the names and characters are all muddled around. So the story is 100% what happened. The who is often altered a little bit to help protect. And certainly I didn't want to hold back with the negative aspects of it. 537 days as a team, as much as we all worked well as a team to the end, geez, we had our moments. We certainly weren't all friends at the end, and we do keep in touch, but it's they're very different relationships with different team members and myself and others. So that whole process was interesting. But I did find that even at this latter stage, sending it out now to members of the team, it's fairly well received and does stand as a good snapshot of what it was like to miss out on the pandemic and go through all the highs and lows of an Antarctic station for an extended season.
So you weren't expecting to do any more than really 365 days. How was that news broken to you, David? And then how did you communicate that, and how was it received by the station team at Davis?
Yeah, that's right. So we signed up for 1 year, the 24 of us in the wintering team. And you know, for years before that, it had pretty much always gone to plan. You go down for your winter, a year later, you might come home via a different means, but you'll get home a year later. So for us on just after Midwinter's Day 2020, so that's 23rd of June, 2 days after we'd done the midwinter swim and the celebrations of midwinter and the end being in sight, a few months after that, we were supposed to get the first flights into Davis that would have started ferrying a few of us home early, and then the change out would have happened via air. My boss, the operations manager at the AAD at the time, on the video meetings, just said, look, the new icebreaker that's being built in Romania, as you know, it's not going to be ready in time to come and get you guys. It's been delayed indefinitely. We've chartered another ship, but I don't think that's going to be able to get to you guys anytime this year. It'll have to come early next year. And we can't get any of the planes that we used back down from North America down to Antarctica. So you guys are going to have to stay until early 2021, which took it was like a sledgehammer to the group's morale. And we made a decision. I ended up breaking the news to the team, and they took it really well. And it did take a while for us to fully unpack the impact. And it wasn't until the anniversary of when we got to Antarctica, which was November 2019, and then a year later, November 2020, when we should have been going home. And I think it's one of the best chapters in the book because it's not penguins and sunshine and helicopters and glaciers like the first chapters are. Yeah. It's right in the depths of winter. We've been there for a year, and we had the absolute mundane task of refilling the station's water supply, which gives them water security for about 5 years. You only do it every 5 years. And it was just day after day of monotonous, boring Antarctic work, like walking up and down a hose or staring at a hose, spraying water into the station tarn. And minus 15 to 20 degrees, long hours, shift work. Morale was it's absolutely, everyone was at each other's throats. And there was 24 expert plumbers at the time. I was one of them as well, going, well, what if we do this way? And that was just, a horrendous experience. And that was all based around, like, at the back of our minds, right then and there, we should have all been going home a week or two later.
Instead, we're doing this.
And we had months to go. And there was still a lot of uncertainty about exactly how and when we'd get home and what the world would look like when we did get home. That was also sort of the umbrella over the top of the whole thing of, is getting home sooner actually a solution to any of the problems we have? So, yeah.
Before we leave that, I just want to touch on, I thought that was a fantastic passage in the book about the tarn and some of the issues you had. Could you describe for our listeners, so my understanding from, and nothing further than reading your book, but the Tarn's water supply, it was a glacially formed sort of reservoir, but you resupply it through desalination? Correct.
So Davis Station has this bizarre situation. It's about 30 k's from the Antarctic plateau, which has 90% of the world's fresh water, but we're too far away from it to actually access that easily. So what we run is a desalination plant. Now, you can't run that plant all year round. So what they've done historically at Davis is we refill a small station tarn. So it's a glacial formed lake, but we refill it with seawater every 5 years, and then you can desalinate that. Mm-hmm. Of course, after 5 years, the extract or the kind of return pipe fills that up and becomes hypersaline with the water. So we have to pump that out and then pump in 5 years worth of fresh seawater. And all in all, I think it was around 117 hours of pumping in total over about a 3-week period with a couple of days off here and there because of weather and whatnot. And a task that if you were doing that on a farm in Australia, pumping that water into it from the lower dam to your upper dam, piece of cake. Yep. You turn on the pump in the morning, let it run all day, occasionally refuel it and get on with the rest of your farm work while that happens. Down in Antarctica, obviously when the air's minus 15 degrees, those couplings were freezing, so you have to hit them with a rubber mallet all the time to kind of stop the ice accumulation. Even then, it was an uphill battle to keep the hose flowing. You'd have blowouts, breakages, and the minute the hose stopped pumping, if it had any water in it, you had minutes until that turned into a giant, Zupa duper.
I loved that description, a 150 metre long Zupa duper. Just imagine wielding that thing.
That's right. And then we did have a few occasions where we just, as hard as we try, when we had to pack up rapidly because of a blowout or weather had sort of got in the way, you'd end up with these 1 or 2 metre lumps of ice in the thing somewhere, and we'd have to kind of manage them onto the tray or the sled and get it back into the warm store overnight to thaw out and melt, and then you start again the next day, and it just seemed never ending. And it still gives us flashbacks. Anyone that was there would never recommend refilling the Davis Station tarn.
Well, it sounds like you've given the next 5 years worth of expeditioners a leg up in that respect.
Yeah. Oh, and then the kicker to that is that allegedly, I've confirmed this, but the year before they were supposed to do it and it kind of declined. They're like, it'll be all right for another year. So shout out to the team before us.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
It sounds like it's going to go in the urgent, not important end of Eisenhower's matrix. We'll leave that to the next team.
And so your water supply is desalinated seawater. Did you ever get in, when I read that passage about a glacially formed reservoir, that sounds like something you'd pay $10 for in a little 500ml bottle. Did you ever get any of the good stuff while you were down there?
Oh, absolutely. And geez, if you could get that stuff back to Australia, the best thing is when you've got some of the icebergs or the ice cores where you've got glacial ice that's been compressed over, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of years. It compresses all the air inside. So when you can get access to that through cores, or if icebergs have flipped and you can get the bergy bits off them, you chip that down into a nice little ice cube size thing and drop that in your whiskey. And then as it melts, the air bubbles all expand. So you get this like sizzling ice cube in your whiskey. And I sent a photo once to a friend. It was a kind of glacial, 100,000-year-old kind of glacial ice cube in a Negroni, and just go like, if you could get this to Melbourne, imagine what you could sell it for. But the sheer logistics of shipping icebergs from Antarctica to Australia would make the price point prohibitive. But yeah.
I once saw a fountain pen that was inlaid with mammoth ivory that someone had found, in a fossil sort of thing. I reckon a similar sort of demographic would definitely buy the glacial ice for their single malts.
Yeah, that's right.
So attitudes and behaviours are fractured as you tell people you're going to spend an extended period down at Davis. What can you say or do to try and galvanise the team to just hold it together?
Yeah, and look, in a lot of ways, this sort of links back to some of the stuff in your book. It was really what became, or what do you call, like a complex problem or a wicked problem that I kind of realized early on there wasn't going to be a lot of solutions. The only solution to 99% of the problems we had was go home. And it was the one thing we couldn't do. So, and there was efforts. I'd often try and lead the charge on social activities or changing up the workplace activities and focusing on, can we do more field work as opposed to maintenance work? And then you get pushback from the head builder and plumbers or someone who'd say like, well, if we do more field work, then maintenance falls behind. And it became this problem of like, there's no solution to this other than keep going and keep trying. And with organised fun, at times the attendance would be complete. And if it was exciting, everyone would turn up and it was great. I think on one occasion there was, one guy turned up and he's like, well, was this worth it? I'm like, if it was worth it for you, it was worth it. Because I saw that became my role, just keep pushing this rather than let everyone just go into their cave and read books and watch Netflix by themselves, which, funnily enough, the internet wasn't good enough for everyone to do that. One or two people could watch Netflix at a time, and that was it. So there wasn't a solution to keeping everyone together, but jobs like even refilling the tarn, that was one of those sort of type 2 fun activities that horrible at the time. You do not enjoy it, but you look back and go, geez, that was a good team building activity. And is as much as we were at each other's throats occasionally, when it came to then the complicated medical evacuation we had to do around Christmas 2020, I was so impressed by the way everyone just parked all their other differences and came together with that common task and common goal. Right, we've got a medical emergency. We've got to get someone out of here. Yeah. We had to pull aircraft from the Chinese and the American programs at distances, across the stretch, across most of the southern hemisphere between Australia and Antarctica, and took 10 days. And it was funny actually rereading your story about the Pong Su, where you spend all these days planning, working 12, 14-hour days and even longer. And then you start, we had that. We planned for days to get this operation off and then had to execute it. But at the time, everyone pulled together and was able to, pull off one of the most sort of audacious medical evacuations I'd ever done.
I want to come back to that medical evacuation because it's a gripping sort of passage from your book. But before I do, the point about enforced fun, one of my favourite sections in the book deals with ping and pong. And, you talk about this sort of low ebb and people on each other's nerves. Can you explain the ping and pong story for our listeners?
Yeah, so the ping and pong story, for some reason, it was not my decision. The ping pong table was in the middle of the lounge. You're pretty short on space up there. So you've got the upstairs of the living quarters is a lounge space with chessboards and a library, a cinema, some computers, and it's sort of near the bar. The bar's around the corner, and the bloody ping pong table. And after dinner, these two cats used to just stand there kind of padunk, 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 padunk. No emotion, no game involved. They just stood there and just hit the ball back and forth, which was fine, but you kind of felt like, play a game, guys. What are you just sort of mindlessly disrupting everyone else's peace and quiet? And I used to like sitting there with a glass of wine, debriefing different scientists and stuff. And yet at the same time, I felt some of the biggest mistakes I made were in the social space of overstepping the mark, that my job is to run the station and oversee all the operations and safety in that. But you sort of have to let the social side of things go. And I would have loved to have just gone, hey, cool, ping pong, no, not from 6 o'clock till 7 o'clock after dinner is the no ping pong hour. But before that, I'd made a huge mistake of saying, hey, let's, I'd got some feedback from a few expeditioners saying, I'm not really happy with people wearing singlets and gym gear in the mess at dinner time. We've got 90 odd people crammed into a pretty small mess. And so I'm like, yeah, no, that's a good idea. No singlets or dirty gym gear in the mess. And then that was met with uproar from the singlet wearers and kind of like, well, I've only got this much time to go to the gym and get a feed and all this stuff. And you're like, yeah, okay. So I was very reluctant to step in and intervene with ping and pong. And it just became part of life that you had to be able to focus in on what you want to do and find your space to have some peace and quiet, and accept that you'll never find that. But at the flip side, another little story that's not in the book actually was I used to play guitar as one of my main ways to keep myself sane. And I'd occasionally sneak away from sort of after dinner drinks on a special occasion, so on a Friday or Saturday night. And there's a little band room annex near the LQ. And I'd go in there and just play guitar, play a couple of songs and have one last beer and then go to bed. And for one night, one person just joined in. He's like, oh, what are you? He's like, oh, can I join in? And he starts joining in, and then another person joins in, and then another person joins in. And before long, everyone's in there playing triangle and all sorts of stuff. And I was like, this is supposed to be station leader quiet time. 12-piece band here singing Wagon Wheel. But it was a lot of fun. And that was some of the best memories where you just sort of relax and enjoy it.
Part of the reason I love that ping and pong story is because it just sounds like, some form of torture, just this inane, pointless sort of white noise in the background that would get on your nerves. But the other thing that I find really interesting, we clearly teach a lot of leadership and do a lot of work with corporate clients. And there's a framework by Daniel Goleman, talking about these different leadership styles. And one of them's affiliative, where you put people first, even over the mission. And I remember always thinking that'd never happen. It's a useless style of leadership. And then we've had the privilege of working with AAD on some of the pre-deployment leadership training, and through your stories, it's a really very real thing that we need to prioritise harmony, particularly in that winter period. And it's really interesting seeing that coming out in your stories.
For sure. And I always found, I used to describe my own leadership style as very adaptive. And there are some books and stuff written on that style of leadership. But just being able to switch between the modes. And when you could be a social, relaxed, just anything goes, everyone's opinion, like, well, let's look at all the options kind of leader, the laissez-faire style, let that happen. If that's what's right for the occasion. And in an Antarctic station, you've got to live with everyone. So you do have to kind of give a bit back and be open to doing it other people's ways. But when it came to then putting on the hat of running our emergency training scenarios, or when push came to shove and things got tough, and you sort of go, well, there's no time for democracy in a crisis. We're doing it my way. And if that doesn't work, it's on me. Or you kind of delegate the worry to different people, and they'll be, oh, well, what about this? You're like, that's not your job. Your job's this. He's doing that plan. You're doing this plan. Just forget about that and focus on what you're doing. And you have to be that really, decisive,
directive.
Yeah, directive leader. And that was something that I found. I think I did that well. I think it worked most of the time to be able to go, now's not a time for discussion.
Mm. On the station leader alone time, I remember when we did the interview, season 3, episode 3, Leadership in the Freezer, you talked about it being relentless, that you're trying to do a gym workout or butter your toast and people are coming at you with all sorts of problems. In the Resilient Shield, we talk about the importance of psychological transition from, intra-work activities, from work to home, from home to work, and that sets you up for success. In a recent ABC interview, you talk about work-life boundaries as one of your top 5 takeaways. How can you achieve work-life boundaries or a psychological transition as a leader in an environment like Davis?
It's tough. It's really tough. But everyone did. That was probably the one thing that everyone understood, because you'd been a victim of it and you'd been a perpetrator of it in terms of asking questions out of hours. So we did get very clear that once it got past sort of 6 p.m. or after dinner, or even a little bit after that, depending on the day of the week and the vibe, that if you've got a work question, you've got to, number one, just at least start with, hey, I've got a work question, do you mind? And then they can say, yeah, that's fine. And I, most of the time, probably did say yes, but there'd be occasions where I'm like, just no, park it.
Can it wait?
Especially if it was going to be a discussion that probably wasn't going to be favourable for what outcome they looked for. And there's often then that gaming of, if I ask Dave in front of other people, he might be more likely to say yes. And you just have to go, no, that's the discussion for tomorrow. And they're like, oh, well, why not now? And you're like, because it's not now. It's not urgent. It can wait. And it was incredibly tough. And not just tough for me. That's tough for everyone, that everyone could get questions after hours, be it the plumbers, the builders, the mechanics, the Met guys, like everyone would get questions. So that's where drawing those lines and sticking to them and backing your team to say no when it's inappropriate. And if I was guilty of that, they'd call me out and I'd be like, yeah, fair call. That's for tomorrow.
You touched on the medical evacuation earlier, and I'm really keen to come back to that because, clearly it sounds like a really key event during your time. Can we start by describing what sort of medical capability do you have down on the ice?
Yeah, so it's pretty limited. It's a well-equipped medical centre. There's only the one doctor in the winter time, and then we train 4 members of the team as lay surgical assistants, so probably like patrol medic standard for your military listeners out there.
I really love that term, lay surgical assistant. Yep. If someone is performing surgery on me, I do not want them to be lay. I want them to be an expert, and yet that's what you're dealing with, a plumber who's had a soldier's 5 on a scalpel.
That's right. And certainly, with like boat crews, because we call them competent crew, but we certainly don't call the surgical assistant competent. So, but they're incredible. And look, we had enough time down there. We all got to learn like all sorts of advanced stuff that, as you know, you don't learn outside of places like the military or an Antarctic station with just the wintering. And they're really skilled. So they often use the carpenters or chefs and trades who are really good with their hands and actually could be pretty handy at suturing or assisting the doctor.
Using a power tool on your internal organs.
Splinting. A carpenter would be good at splinting.
So,
orthopedic surgery.
The thing for us, and certainly in the beginning, was that when I sat down with the doctor, when COVID broke out and we got the first sort of stories of it, we still had 80 odd people on station in summer 2019-20, and we're getting towards the end of summer when COVID was taking hold around the world. And I went over to the doctor and we just sort of went through what have we got on station, and everything we had was equipment and certainly the human side of the training was all around cold injuries and impact, like severed arteries because of an ice axe through a leg, or the compound fractures and frostbite, or anything to do with that. We had all of that stuff trained for it for days and had all of the equipment ready to go. We had one ventilator, and if we'd had an actual COVID outbreak or a major flu outbreak on station, you're like, yeah, it's just nothing. We are not equipped for that, because everything we ever trained for was cold injuries. And you're like, bugger, okay. And that was the shift in the pivot for the Antarctic program. Then you're like, right, that's it. No more southbound expeditioners. The ship has to do 14 days at sea before anyone gets off it. And they drew a very hard line very early to just keep those stations safe. And that led to, in a lot of ways, us being, stuck there longer. But it was a fact of like, well, actually, it's the safest thing to do. And as much as that's the right decision, it still hurts when you're in the team and you get told that news. But
yeah, it's tough with the benefit of hindsight, as we're looking now at Omicron and kind of lots of people have had it and the whole world didn't die. I mean, Stanfast says obviously there'd been a tragic amount of deaths. But remembering back to when it first broke out, there was, I remember doing crisis management planning with clients thinking that this is going to have a massive mortality rate and what if it gets in water supplies or, these kind of things, all that kind of speculation. It was pretty serious considerations. And given what you've just described about your medical capability, I can only imagine how seriously you were taking it down there.
Oh, that's right. And look, they say with crisis, your moment of recognition is so important. And the earlier you can recognize you're in a crisis, the better chance you've got of responding correctly. And the AAD and government called it so early for the Antarctic stations. We're like, what the hell? But they went on to the whole crisis management footing across the division, and which is normally reserved for things like medical evacuations or ship running aground or the ship catching fire. Like that's a crisis that you pivot all your resources to this one problem. And they called that, I think about January 9th or something. And I don't think the government had officially declared a pandemic at that point, but the AAD said, we're doing this. And thank God they did, because that possibly avoided a lot of other problems and certainly led to some pushback at the time from science programs that got cancelled and flights that got cancelled and all sorts of stuff. But you look in hindsight, well, actually, if they'd had an outbreak at a station, it would have been, at the time, pretty catastrophic because we just didn't know anything about the virus.
And what would be the effect of losing someone from the team? I know the AAD has had some fatalities in the past. Can you reflect on that and the potential impacts on a station of actually losing one of your own in that circumstance? Yeah,
I mean, it would be absolutely devastating, and thankful that never happened during my time, which would have been, because ordinarily, if that does happen, you've got to be able to get the person or the body out of there, and those dramatically affected by it would be able to rotate out as well, and you get some fresh air into the team with some new people that might help the dynamic. But it would be one of those scenarios that you just don't wish on anyone. But as the station leader and the doctor, we did have plans for that stuff, and there's kits and procedures down there for those eventualities, because unfortunately, even just through natural causes, we're not, what's the quote in your book from Julius Caesar or whoever it was about, we're not...
the Marcus Aurelius, we're all going to end up the worm food, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So you kind of have to be ready for that, but you just hope it doesn't happen.
And what about the fire on the vessel coming home? I mean, the last hurrah, you'd think, oh, geez, just a couple of days out, we're home and hosed. How did that manifest itself, and what was the response from your team, but also the ship's crew?
Yeah, it was just like unbelievable that's how it all ended. We'd spent, because after Davis, so the ship came and picked us up from Davis, and we then went across to Mawson Station, and we couldn't get closer than 90 nautical miles. So that's the whole resupply via air, which took I think about 2 weeks of just flying like internal loads in a Squirrel B3. They got 4 sorties a day.
I was going to say that the internal capacity of a Squirrel B3 is what?
It's nothing.
A small handbag.
That's right. If they'd been able to get a bit closer, we could have slung cage pallets. But internal. Anyway, so we had 2 weeks of sitting there kind of de-stuffing 20-foot containers into internal loads on the choppers and getting pretty sick of that. So finally they're like, okay, we're done with that. They've got enough food and fuel they had enough fuel left over, but they put everything ashore, everyone ashore. We're done. We're turning. We'll be in Hobart in 12 days. Call your families, tell your friends, get ScoMo ready. Let's, we're going to be in Hobart on this date probably, and that's it. And so I went back to my cabin and started restuffing all your gear, and you go, cool, I'm going to put my Antarctic gear kind of in that bag and start to think about getting home. And you've got to lash everything down. Crossing the Southern Ocean is not an easy journey at the best of times. So you're lashing everything down and packing everything away for this journey home. And mentally, you're like, cool, we're done. And to then just wake up to a fire alarm and the captain just clear as day over the radio in my memory as well, just fire in the engine room, not a drill. And you wake up pitch black in the cabin or dim emergency lighting. You can smell smoke, you can taste it. And then you come out of your cabin, you've got your Antarctic survival bag, which has got all your gear and equipment to kind of, if you had to go and make a camp on Heard Island, you'd be all right. You've then got a bloody immersion suit that's another sort of 5 odd kilos and bulky. You're trying to put your jacket on. My boots were by that point, a year and a half old, so they were falling apart and held together with duct tape. And you come out of your cabin and everyone's just in the same disheveled state of gear and bags and equipment. And you get down to the forecastle, which was a semi-enclosed space that had holes in it where the anchor chains went out. So we're still getting pretty good cold breeze from the Southern Ocean. And we stood there for 6 hours while the crew fought the fire. A number of the AAD team were involved in fighting the fire too, to just contain it. And boundary cooling and everything, as you know, on ships becomes really important. It just consumed numbers of people to get on hoses, and there was some really, really brave actions of a number of crew and expeditioners to get the fire under control. And then we're like, well, can we get the other engines going? And it was this case of, well, we don't know yet. It might have burnt out all of the electronics, or it might have had a bigger impact on the control system, so we don't know. And we're sitting, beam on to 6 meter swell, so you're rolling nearly 30 degrees in the ship as well. And there was weather coming in. If we hadn't been able to get going, there was some much bigger seas bearing down on us. And you're just standing there going, well, all right, what's the lifeboats and sailing to Heard Island going to look like? And, it's no one alive knows what it was like to be on the James Caird sailing to South Georgia. But at the time, I'm like, it'll be a modern day version of that.
Yep.
Trying to get to Heard Island, which was the nearest land, but by no means, there's no city or anything there. There's a few old whaling sheds that might have been better than being on a ship. But eventually they did get the ship going, and we limped home to Fremantle. But as I talk about in the book, it was the change between being just a passenger catching a ride home to then after that, everyone was in a very different emotional state and very much aware of the fight or flight response that we'd all had to one degree or another in the bowels of that ship. And I started talking to different members of the team about it. And the AAD did a great job trying to help us, but at the same time, we still had this unfolding crisis. We were still in the middle of a crisis, and we had patchy Wi-Fi and satellite phones was about as good as we could do. So they're trying to support us. And yet actually the best way to support us was just, we'll support each other on the ship. Once we get home, you can do everything else. And that was tough, but also brought out, some incredible actions and, bravery from people.
And what about for yourself personally? I mean, you've come from a position where absolutely everything stops with you. You're making decisions, you're leading throughout this entire extended period and all the ups and downs that we've spoken about. And now you're, from the sounds of things, I'm trying to think of the more politically correct, you're a bit of a spare wheel while this crisis is unfolding. How did that hit you from going to those extremes?
Yeah, for sure. And it's not my quote, but another station leader once said, there's nothing more useless than another station leader. So it's like officers, one's enough.
Arguably too much in a lot of circumstances.
That's right. So look, when the fire bell, when the alarm started ringing and we're going to the forecastle, and I could hear the captain and the voyage leader and deputy voyage leader their conversations and their frame of mind and the unknowns about what was going on, I did for 1 second think, well, it's kind of glad I'm not in charge of this one. I've had my emergency with the medical evacuation and stuff, which I was probably more in control of. You had a bit more control over that than the fire. But very quickly then just went, okay, well, what can I do to help out here? And the best thing was just find individuals that weren't coping, chat to them, help them, and be a point of contact for members of my team or others because I knew I'd been in the voyage leader's position. And I'm like, the last thing he needs is people asking him questions. So myself and Matt, who was the outgoing station leader from Mawson, we started just trying to act as a bit of a unofficial buffer. So if there's question, we stay informed of what was happening. And if people had questions, they could come to us before they annoyed the voyage leader, who was happy to help them as well, but it just helped him a bit. And then sitting at the table, we convened what they call the incident management team on the ship, which is a bit of an ad hoc, but a formal structure where you've got your voyage management and the captain and others involved. And we sat on that table and helped out where we could, as well as a number of members from my team who rose to the occasion to form kind of auxiliary fire teams and additional support roles when, we've been away for over a year and a bit, and by every right, they could have just sat back and watched, but they happily stood up and
stepped up.
Yeah, which was really impressive and sort of tantamount to the character of the people at the Antarctic program. Either attracts or builds while they're down there.
Churchill famously said, never waste a good crisis, but it sounds like you were happy to waste that one. Actually, the fire's one thing, but I could think of nothing more horrific, having been in the Southern Ocean, as a ship without any propulsion in those seas. That must have been terrifying.
Yeah, it wasn't great. It was, and like that ship rolled quite a lot as well. I don't know if you Google MPV Everest or have a look at the photos in my book or on my website, you can see it. It's got the helipad kind of attached to the front top of the bridge, which creates this like top-heavy
center of gravity thing. Yeah,
center of gravity, which I don't think helps it in giant swells, and the wavelength of the swells in the Southern Ocean as well probably wasn't helping it. And you just had to walk around constantly half falling over and trying to lean into the pitch sometimes. But then I did a voyage this summer on a cargo vessel, the Happy Dragon, which is a 150-meter cargo ship. And obviously with waves, you always want to face the bow into the waves or have them at least, perpendicular. And they were saying, no, actually, sometimes that can be a problem because on the longer cargo ship, as you're cresting the waves, it pulls the prop out of the water. And it can create a bending moment and stuff. And you're like, geez, being a ship captain, you're like, I thought you just stood around with a cup of tea and set the compass heading. But there's a lot more to work out.
All ahead, 3/4 steam.
That's right.
To start it. Yeah. Say cool things like that.
Yeah.
You spoke about midwinter before. Really interested in the, I guess, the significance of this. Can you provide a bit of background on midwinter and particularly how you commemorate that?
Yeah, it's coming up in a couple of days actually, and it's the most historical moment of the season because a lot of people can visit Antarctica in the summertime, but very few get the privilege of wintering over, and it's such a different experience than a summer. It's pitch dark for Davis, 23 hours a day. You get a dim twilight for an hour. You seasonal affective disorder, they call it. You're moping around. It's hard to stay motivated. There's a long way to go. But the minute you're through midwinter, the days get longer. But by 14 minutes a day, there's more sunshine and the end becomes in sight. And we sit down for this very formal dinner and the Governor General sends a message, the Minister or the Prime Minister will send messages, you get messages from celebrities, you send out invitations all around the world and see who replies. And 2020 was a great one because everyone was stuck at home in lockdowns and whatnot. So we got some great video replies and it creates this atmosphere of, okay, you have now joined the club of winterers and that's it. And you don't get given your wintering medallion then and there, you get that later, but that's when you earn it, when you sit down on that day in the middle of winter and remember what it was like 100 years ago when they sat down and commemorated those nights as well.
And of course, the midwinter swim, there's an awesome image in your book of you really sucking it up. I love Wim Hof's stuff. I sort of get into that, but that's taking it to the next level, isn't it?
Yeah, that was, I mean, they say it's not a tradition, but it very much is an unofficial tradition to go for a swim at midwinter. You have to cut a hole in the ice. You know, it's nearly 2 meters thick at that point as well. So then you have to have someone that stands there stirring it so it doesn't refreeze.
With you in it.
Yeah. And then I was always worried that a seal or something would come up underneath. So, they see a hole in the ice, like, ooh, I can get some air. And that has happened in different years. And most of the team jumped in, and it was this great sort of event to just go, all right, we've now all done the stupidest thing you can do, which is go swimming in Antarctica in the middle of winter. It's minus 20 degrees in the air, minus 2 in the water. Getting out by far colder than getting in once you're wet, and standing there while the field training officer undoes the safety line. And then you try and warm. You cannot warm up for hours. I don't think I felt my toes for days.
There's an awesome picture in the book. The symmetry, the way that the holes cut in the ice, looks amazing. How do they cut that?
We cut it with an auger on a skid steer, kind of little bobcat thing. We just put a 1 meter auger on that and drilled 4 holes that kind of lined up. The other way to do it is to do it with chainsaws. And the mechanics, we talked about it as well. And we're like, well, chainsaws was technically the more approved method. And we were like, well, honestly, standing around with chainsaws, like on your knees, trying to cut through ice, the safety parameters around that were like, if we just put the auger on the little bobcat, that might be safer. But
you'd need that
bobcat,
carpenter.
If you break through and the bobcat sinks, you then can't get out. And you just have to, you've risk managed and work out a plan and drill your hole.
There'll be plenty of people listening that are really interested in going down south and joining an expedition. What makes a good expeditioner?
Understand your own motivation is the number one key. Go down there for the right reasons, and also have a sense of it. And that, for me, would be to have a sense of adventure. That there's all the things that are on the brochure, and you'll get to do a lot of those. You'll get to see penguins and seals and wildlife and fly or sail down there on the ships. And all of that's incredible, but that's the brochure. The realities of it are much tougher and harder to deal with. But if you want that adventure, it'll deliver it in spades. It's not a job per se. Once you're down there, it's a lifestyle. And that would be the adaptability and a kind of social self-awareness would be very key to group harmony and individual success as well.
I think those sort of highlights that you mentioned, while clearly it's not every day, as you said, I think before is penguins and bloody Southern Lights or whatever, but there must be some incredible moments. I look back on my military career and I refer to these things as SAS moments, SAS moments, where it doesn't matter how rich you are, doesn't matter, you will never get an opportunity outside that specific context to, I don't know, sit on the side of a mountain overlooking the sort of Hindu Kush, or, fly helicopters down the Brisbane River and assault the casino. Clearly your book is full of some of these. What ones really stick out into your mind as these AAD moments that you so cherish?
Oh, I used to call them #Antarctica moments. and honestly, you look out the window and almost every day, if there's not a blizzard. I had one that actually it's not in the book, but so I'll tell it on the podcast. We'd been down to the Indian station. This is in the first summer, so about a 1 hour flight away down to the Indian station. We took a bunch of scientists down there for a symposium with the Russians, Chinese, and Indians. And that story is in the book. But on the way back, we were a bit later than we were intending to be. So getting towards sort of 8 or 9 o'clock at night, probably even possibly a bit later, because we'll run on these different time zones down there. So the sun's it's hitting its sunset mode. It's not going to set because it's summer, but you've got this like orange light, just all 360 degrees around you. We're flying back along the edge of a number of glaciers in between the Lasman Hills, where the Indian stations are, and then Davis up in the Vestfold Hills. And we're flying along these ice cliffs, and because it had been such a hot day, the glaciers are melting on the top, just forming these waterfalls that are now cascading, not always off the edge of the glacial tongues as well, but sort of through it. And so you've got these jets of water spurting out the side of the glacier, this sunset and this dead still water. and you're flying along in this helicopter, just going like, oh, hashtag Antarctica right there. And those moments, you just, and the great thing is you can't buy those moments. You can travel to Antarctica on tourist ships and all sorts of stuff, but some of those moments, like that, those conditions right then and there, you may not get to see ever again. And I really pinch myself at times to think that, geez, this is my job, to be here right now. And that's an incredible. And I've always thought jobs like that in the past too, that don't pay to go and do something. I think it's someone to pay you to do it.
That's much cleverer.
Why don't you just wait here at the bar while I go outside and go around the corner and get our car? We'll leave this old town behind, buy some beers, drive down south till dawn. Or we can cruise down along the coast, maybe park down by the swell. Tune into the big US radio, 18 million. The party's gone too far this time.
We asked you in February 2021 what was the first thing you were going to do when you came back, and after hugs or fist bumps or whatever we were doing back then, you said, I want to go and get a coffee, go for a walk and not be bothered by anyone. What did you do when you first get back?
Yeah, well, because we came back to Fremantle, I still had a night and a morning of kind of work-ish stuff to do there. So I as much as I was back in Australia, and I did go and get a coffee and walk in some green grass, and did get down to the beach to stand in some sand. It wasn't the same. It wasn't until I got back to Melbourne and came home and just put everything away, put my phone and everything away, and just went out in bare feet and walked around Albert Park Lake near my house in Melbourne, and stood in the grass and looked back at the city that I'd sort of longed for, and just by myself for a while, reflecting on everything that I'd been through and everything that had led me to be sitting there that particular day, and what I was pretty worried about what the world was going to be like. I'd already had a pretty rude shock at Perth Airport with how crowded it was. And I'm like, geez, that I never had problems with crowds after other trips, and this one, and most of my team have said the same thing. Perth Airport was pretty rough on us.
Perth Airport's pretty rough at the best of times, in fairness.
Yeah, that's right. And over the next day or so, but the first time I went to a cafe, I got Karened by someone that I just wandered in, and they're like, excuse me, there's already 4 people in here. And I'm like, well, and then you realize there's a giant sign that says, maximum occupancy 4 people. You're like, oh, that stuff. I was so out of touch, and no one knew that, or this, why is this guy an idiot? And you're like, well, sorry, I'm new to this. And at that point, everyone had had a year of it.
Yeah, how are you new to this?
Sort of asking, have you been on a different planet? That's like,
I remember being so disappointed. The first avocado I had, I was so disappointed as well. It was just not quite ripe. And I'm like, a year and a half without avocados, and the first one you get, and it's not good. But and seeing my nieces, and that was just amazing to sort of reconnect and see how much they'd grown, and catch up with my friends and family as well about what they'd been through. And I'd forgotten that as tough as everything we went through, Melbourne in particular was pretty scarred, and it had a very rough time of 2020.
Nearly had 537 days of COVID in Victoria. Lockdown. So on the subject of adjustments, Mark Wales talks about this in his book Survivor. When he comes back from Afghanistan, he just looks at people and they just don't get it, I think is the quote he uses. How long did that take for things to normalise?
I think far longer than I expected. It's over a year since I got back, including I did go back to Antarctica in that time, so it's kind of reset it. But only very recently have I started to feel really back to normal and comfortable and happy to go out and kind of be my old self. And that's not uncommon for everyone else around who's had a rough time of lockdown. But it was hard to explain what I'd been through, and that helped with it. The book helped a lot just to explain it to my family and a few friends that just didn't get it. And then you could just go, hey, just read this chapter. And they're like, oh man, you're like, yeah, it was pretty rough. So that helped me help others understand what I'd been through, and was a big motivation to get the story out there. But it's changed me in a way, and that's what I talk about in the back of the book with catching up with Dave Sabin, so one of the platoon commanders from Long Tan, and I went and caught up with him for scones and coffee and stories the other day. And it's a weird comparison. It's nothing I went through was the same as what he did and the guys from 6RAR, but the returning to Australia part of it, and how do you grapple with, geez, how do I explain what I just went through, and how do I keep in touch with people that aren't really keen on keeping in touch, and unpacking that when you're trying to also get back to life and find a job and do this other stuff. So that was a unexpected parallel that I had never really thought about until I caught up with Dave.
Does the team get psychologically debriefed when you get back?
Yep, absolutely. Similar to the Army debriefs. In fact, the main psych at the AAD is an ex-Army psych, and the Army psychs used to do it, I think, up until not that long ago. And those support services are available. But as you know, and everyone does these days, it's admitting that you need a bit of help is the hardest step. And then once you are getting a bit of help and having a chat to someone, you go, geez, I needed that. And that's it's a hard one. It's a contract workforce. So there's a few people that have gone back and are wintering again already.
Wow.
And there are others that have had bits to do with the program, like myself, just round trips in the summer. So they keep in touch, but there's others that can slip through the cracks if they're not careful.
I can't remember if I said this last time we spoke on this, but there's a movie called The Odd Angry Shot, which is a wonderful Graham Kennedy and Brian Brown old Vietnam SAS sort of flick. And there's a very poignant scene at the end where they go through all these trials and they have these, experiences, and they lose friends, and they're, grown up, and all this sort of rite of passage stuff. They come home and they go for their first beer, almost this real climax of can't wait to get back and have a beer in Australia. And, the bartender asks, "Oh, you back from Vietnam?" And they sort of, "Yeah, no," and sort of downplay it. And it's that real anticlimax of, you've gone through this life-changing sort of experience, and you come back to the real world and everyone's been doing their own stuff, quite rightly. And it's a really funny adjustment. I use that word anticlimax. I felt that a couple of times coming back from trips where, I don't know, you expect... that everyone else has had this profound experience that you've had, but of course they've had their own stuff, and it just it sort of just goes by the wayside.
For sure, yeah.
What's next for you, David?
Launching the book has been its own wild ride, and running workshops for different corporates and emerging leaders. I think that's the main thing for me, is that it was. I always wanted a leadership challenge like this, and until I had it, and that creates a whole range of other emotions. But I made a conscious decision when it was tough to go, okay, make the most of this, because this is so unique and so challenging. So for me, it became learning as much as I can about being in that situation. So my goal now is to try and teach others about those experiences and what I got right and what I got wrong and what they can learn from it. And that's corporates, charities, schools, law enforcement, defense, whoever. And I've enjoyed that. I know you guys work in a similar space, and you get a lot out of it yourself by telling your story and helping others. And, it helps you realize, like, oh, well, I've actually got some good experience here. And then you learn from the teams and the junior leaders and others out there. So that's what I'm doing at the moment. I love it, and hope that kind of carries on as long as I can milk it.
Yeah, look, and to your point earlier, I think, there's some wonderful theory out there about leadership, and it can provide great frameworks, but it doesn't necessarily survive contact with the real world. And having someone with your depth of experience to say, well, this is a good start point, but it's a messy, complex, you've got to mumble, sort of work your way through it. Could be really useful. How can people get in touch with you if they do want to leverage off that incredible experience that you've got in leadership development?
Yeah, so just jump on my website, www.davidknoff.com. Follow the book's Instagram account at 537 Days of Winter. And, of course, buy the book, listen to the podcast, and I'm happy to chat to and work with anyone out there that's interested.
Awesome. You can also find David on Instagram and LinkedIn, and we'll put the links in the show notes.
David, before we leave, I cannot remember if we asked last time, but a question we often like to ask our guests are, what is your power song? Did we ask you that last time?
We didn't. My go-to, like, not karaoke song, but if someone gives me a guitar at a party and says, "Hey, you play guitar," I play "Free Fallin'" by
Tom Petty.
Yeah, Tom Petty, and I love that. How do you know a skydiver was on your podcast? He's got to mention it. So as a skydiver, you have to sing that, and it always just pictures just go, "Hey, jumping out, playing "Free Fallin'," and that's my go-to guitar song.
I love that. And is there a song that evokes memories of being on the ice? I mean, on a couple of our deployments, there's been sort of songs that whenever I hear them, I go straight back to a moment of that. Do you have similar sort of musical touchstones from your time down there?
Absolutely. Wagon Wheel by Darius Rucker. That was sung at like it was an open mic night that we had one of the pilots dress up as kind of a David Lee Roth style MC, and he MC'd that, which was just hilarious. And that was played then at the end of any other band night or any night in the bar or any time, even just on kitchen duty or slushy, that would come on every playlist, and you just in the back of your mind, you just Wagon Wheel.
I love it. Well, we'll chuck a bit of Tom Petty and a bit of Darius Rucker onto the Unforgiving 60 playlist on Spotify.
But it's on there, Free Fallin' by Tom Petty on the Unforgiving 60 playlist on Spotify. It is there now.
Wow. And we'll chuck Wagon Wheel on as well. David, thank you. Really appreciate you taking the time. You're in a bit of a whirlwind at the moment. I think we've caught you between TV appearances. You're certainly a man in demand on the back of your new book, and rightly so. 537 Days of Winter. We'll provide all the links, as Tim mentioned before, but really want to thank you for your time this morning.
Perfect, and my pleasure being on again. Thanks, guys, and best of luck with everything you guys are up to as well.
Cheers
Dad.
Now to the debrief. We try to go always a little further in this podcast and greatly appreciate your input. Please let us know your feedback, the good, the bad, or the ugly. Also, if you know someone who is living a life less ordinary, we'd love to hear about them. You can get in touch at debrief@unforgiving60.com. That's debrief@unforgiving60.com. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please tell your friends and write a review for us on Apple Podcasts. Until next episode, keep filling your unforgiving minutes with 60 seconds worth of distance run. See you next time on the Unforgiving 60.